Well, good afternoon to everybody and welcome to Louis' debate of this afternoon. It is really a great pleasure. In fact, I'm delighted to host two distinguished speakers today who will be moderated by one of our high-flying professors who is going to be discussing about a very important topic. Let me spend a few words in order to introduce and frame this debate. And let me start with the word debate. At Louis, we are convinced that, being a university, being academics, that debates are fundamental for university life. In fact, universities are places, are contexts to discuss issues, to diverge on issues, to converge on issues, and as a matter of fact, also to thrive on debate. But at Louis, we're also convinced that debating only amongst academics don't go that far, and that's why I'm really delighted to have, as we say, representative of the civil society of the real world, still with the interjection of a colleague. So it's a great pleasure to have you today with us, Giovanna Melandri, who is the president of MAXXI, the MAXXI Museum here in Rome, and Eike Schmidt, who is the director of the Uffizi from Florence, who are going to be moderated during this discussion, during this debate, by Professor Thatcher, who is a professor of political science here at Louis University. Let me spend a few words about two other terms which we've been used to name this debate. We're going to be discussing about the future of museums. And let me start with the latter word, museum. Museum indicates tradition. And universities are amongst the longest lived institution around the world. Well, actually, Louis is not that old. We're only 42 years old, so we're somehow infant as compared to other universities. But we're pretty, we do have our own tradition. Also in the way we believe into tradition. As a matter of fact, tradition and cultural heritage are part and parcels of our educational activities. Mark is leading a program, a 2-year master program in policy analysis and governance in Europe, which does have a major in cultural heritage. Our law school has recently launched a 1-year master in art law in order to prepare those are going to be valuing our arts, protecting our arts. And our business school has launched a master program in arts management. So again, cultural heritage is important for us, but as I mentioned, we do interpret cultural heritage tradition in a fairly, say, innovative way. And we go with Gustav Mahler, who actually argued that tradition is not the worship of the ashes, but is the preservation of fire. So we like tradition as much as we can make it a living phenomenon like fire. And talking about living phenomenon and therefore projection into the future, we're going to be discussing about museum into the future. And again, universities are the appropriate places to discuss about futures because we rely upon our tradition. So we are rooted in our tradition, but we are projected into the futures. Our future graduates do learn about tradition with an innovative spin. So without further ado, I will leave the floor now to Professor Thatcher, who's going to be moderating this debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea. So museums traditionally were, of course, very physical places. You went to them. Now, as we know, people can't go to them. How have you both dealt with the move away from physical visitors? Giovanna, would you like to kick off?
You want me to kick off? Okay, first of all, let me say that I'm very glad to be here with you and very honored to be at Louis, a incredibly active and fertile university in many ways, and also connecting with arts in many of its programs. So how have we dealt? Well, first of all, okay, 2 words on MAXXI. Not everybody not everybody needs to know exactly who we are. I mean, the identity of the institution. MAXXI is the National Museum for Contemporary Art and Architecture. So it's a national platform. I always want to underline that. It's not a Roman museum, it's a national museum. And it is a contemporary platform. It is a museum in the way that we have a collection. We have worked in years, even though we're very young. I mean, we just went through our 10th birthday, 10th anniversary, 2020. It wasn't a very good year to blow our 10 candles, but anyway. It is a museum because it has a collection, and one of the obligations that we have, institutional obligations that we have, is to increase this patrimony, this capital, okay, and to make it, available for everybody in this country. It is a museum because it's a research center. I really want to stress these two notions, a collection and a research institution. I think if we talk about museums with these two, I mean, I'm being very sort of shortcut, but if we talk about museums as places where research is done and where a collection is collected, then we are sort of giving a definition of these kind of institutions. But I always say MAXXI is more than a museum. It's really a platform for future thinking. So again, thank you for remembering this. And so this platform was never turned off by the COVID crisis. We were close, but we were never turned off, which means a lot of things. I don't want to get into the details, but it means, yes, it means that we, as everybody around the world, showed our collections and our pieces of arts through virtual experiences. But my experience, our experience, was very interesting because what we did in the first lockdown, so this was nearly a year ago now, yes, a year ago, not nearly a year ago. What we did was we very rapidly converted ourselves to a broadcaster. And what we did was we asked artists, architects, designers, I mean, the creative community with which we usually work and to which we usually address our ideas of, exhibition and also research projects. Not all our research projects translate into an exhibition, but we have a lot of research projects that are looking at issues of today, being them, geopolitical, ecological, spiritual issues through the lens and the interpretation of artists. So what we did, and this, I will stop on this, what we did was, okay, let's try and ask artists, architects to produce something unique for the digital broadcasting system and platform that we were building. And I have to admit, I would have never thought that we would have had the results that we had. When we started this, I thought, okay, some 100,000, some millions. We were already very, sort of active on social networks, but we had, just in the first lockdown, nearly 16 million of contacts. But I think the reason for that result was that we weren't just, showcasing our objects, our pieces of arts. We were producing with artists and architects new ideas through the process, through the digital process. I'll stop here for this.
Thank you very much, Giovanna. So people used to queue around the block to get into the Uffizi, and suddenly they can't. So, and you have this amazing collection. How did you respond to the fact that people could no longer get in physically at the Uffizi?
Well, along the same lines as Giovanna just told us, the Uffizi is a little bit older than MAXXI. In fact, the collection started in the 15th century, and we celebrated in 2019 our 250th birthday. So just as we hope, I hope I don't show all this age on my forehead, but at any rate, this is when the Uffizi as the first large princely collection was open to the public. So there have been some smaller museums, some smaller princely collections that were opened a few years earlier, but the Uffizi, at the time the Habsburg-Lorraine collection at the Uffizi was the first large the first large princely collection that then became a public collection. And in fact, what's interesting is that already at the time, the Grand Duke Pietro Leopoldo thought a lot about that and why it was necessary to turn the Uffizi 250 years ago into a research center and not just into something to admire. In a way, we took up that tradition. We took it up even before the lockdown, actually, but during the lockdown, thinking of new formats, we definitely thought of that. And there's another thing. So I totally agree with what you said before. But I just want to give another throw a slightly different light also on this, an additional light though, without turning off any of those lights or turning off any of those fires, because of course, I guess as you suggested, as Andrea also suggested, the Uffizi, many people nowadays know it for its ashes, really, rather than for the fire. But there is lots of fires still burning there, and I think to get those out again and to get them bigger, that was certainly one of our goals. The additional light that I would like to throw on this is education, because while in research we had already become very strong before the lockdown, education was mostly limited to Florence and to Tuscany. In fact, we had another anniversary, and that's the 50 years of our education department. A few weeks before Brera in 1970, the Uffizi was the first museum that had a proper education department. There has been museum education before, but it was not institutionalized in a particular department. And just preparing for that celebration, which turned out to be entirely online, but reading those texts from the early 1970s, how our colleagues, some of which are still around, were thinking about going out of the museum, actually, to go to the little villages, go to the outskirts of Florence and get in people that normally wouldn't come to the museum, and especially the younger generation of children. So we really stepped up our education programs, of course, mainly thinking about digital formats, and we did this very thoroughly. So differently from many international museums that actually cut down educational, and I think that is terrible, we immediately thought that the freelancers that work with us, we have an internal education department of about 12 people, but then additionally we have several dozens of freelancers, so we made sure that those would keep their contracts, but instead of having small groups of people in the museum or in the museum classroom, they went online. And I think that is also important. And I think education and research need to be reconnected. Oftentimes these are two different fields. The researchers and the educators never speak to one another. But I think this is also wrong, because the really great new ideas often start from what one might consider to be stupid questions, or for questions not from the field. And without those, we could only incrementally develop. If we talk archaeologists amongst archaeologists or art historians amongst art historians is always informative, but we can never make the big jump. I think it's much, much more interesting to have maybe a 5-year-old girl ask a question that nobody ever asked, and then take that question seriously, and that can bring about an entire research project.
Thank you. Perhaps I could just follow up on that. So you talk about education. You have this wonderful collection, but for many people it's a long way away. It's a different world. How have you tried to reach out to groups who don't usually come? You've had this. You talked about education with the young people, but there are other groups. What have you done to try to bring people in who would never dream of physically coming into the Uffizi?
Well, now actually they do start to dream, and I think this is a good thing. So we went where no one else went before, not on the moon or Mars, but we went onto social networks that people were sniffing at before, such as TikTok, because it wasn't considered to be very serious. But actually, thanks to young people following us on TikTok, I mean, they brought their bigger siblings and even their parents to the museum while we were open between June and November. And we really reached new groups of people, and that's interesting. Of course, this very first contact can be very different than, I mean, we're not confronting them with some theory about spatiality in Giotto or beauty and Botticelli, but that's the second step. There needs to be a first step. I mean, you need an intro, but once you got over the step and you're in, I mean, there's hardly anyone who isn't fascinated. We also had last year a well-known digital entrepreneur from Milan who came to visit the museum for a photo shoot, and she also brought in lots of people that would never ever have gotten to us. And again, there were the old-fashioned critics protesting how terrible it is, but this is totally undemocratic. I mean, we are there for the entirety of Italy and for the entirety of the world. I mean, this is really a World Heritage Site, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, in fact. And therefore, I mean, we can't close our doors and only say, well, you have to have a PhD in order to cross the threshold and come into our galleries. So therefore, this was extremely successful. I mean, we were able to keep the percentage of people under 18 stable, despite the fact that there were no school groups at all last year. Whereas in the age group 90 to 25, we more than doubled, almost 120% more than before. And this is a solid and stable development. So we actually had the same curve as in the year before, if we look month through month, but much, much higher for people up to 25. And this is something that this year we only had a 2 weeks opening, and then we had to close again, but we're preparing very soon to reopen again. But during those 2 weeks we saw that we kept this demographic, and so we're very confident that this strategy really continues to work and has some really long-term impact.
Perhaps I could put the same question to you, Giovanna, from a different angle, because it's one thing having older art, but you have the opposite problem that many people find contemporary art difficult to understand or to relate to.
No.
So how do you reach the parts that other art museums can't reach?
Okay, let me just elaborate one moment on what Eike was saying, because I really totally agree. It's maybe too dull, this conversation, because we are totally agreeing. I mean, the third pillar, the educational pillar, very important, just as important as the other two. So agree. And also I want to say a word around the fact that, yes, especially in, well, not only, but mainly in great contemporary art museums in the US, not putting names there, but I mean, just, you know, you can think about it. the first thing that was erased and cut and definanced was the educational department. We really struggled to do the opposite because we believe that the social outreach, the educational outreach that we can produce as, you know, as an impact to society is essential for our identity. It's not, you know, it's not, how do you say, a topping over the cake. It's really part of the cake. It's part of our identity. And yes, obviously, I would love to have the same lady entrepreneur in digital marketing visit. In fact, she did visit MAXXI. We do have an extended audience in younger demographics. So we have worked a lot in the last 10 years to have the 14th, 18th, and the 18th, 30 sort of age group, which really means working with schools, with universities. So I, first of all, want to, you know, just appeal publicly to the students of this great university to come over, because coming to MAXXI is just not going to museum, is a cognitive experience. I mean, it always is. It is also going to the Uffizi, but it's a research. And now we have just opened a show called A Story for the Future, which is the story of the last 10 years, of our first 10 years, in terms of the artists that we've hosted, the exhibitions that we have worked on, the research lines that we have worked on. So it's an exhibition, non-exhibition, because there's no piece of art. It's just the story of ourselves. And with ANSA, the National Agency for Information, what we did was we sort of aligned the sort of big history, the big story, the big geopolitical story, with the way contemporary artists, so this is to answer your question, I don't want to, you know, to leave it down, with the way that artists and architects have reflected around these major issues, being them, you know, identity issues, social issues, economic issues, geopolitical issues, spiritual issues. And it's really, I really invite you to come when we will open, I hope soon, because it is a quite extraordinary show. You can sort of trace the artistic movements that we have worked with, the artist, and the way that they have, through their intuitions and their, you know, their research, they have, in fact, offered in many cases, and this is evident in the show, really prophetic, you know, prophetic analysis of what has happened afterwards. So some may have some difficulties with contemporary art, but if you go through it, I mean, art is always contemporary. The Uffizi was a contemporary museum, and we really need to sort of overcome prejudices around this. I think what is important is that we offer platforms for discussions, it's platforms for dissemination, platforms for, you know, for thought and for education. So yes, I think that another effect of the pandemic crisis was obviously that our sort of governance structure had to change. As we said, as I very much agree with Eike Schmidt, we decided not at all to cut our educational department. So that, that has effects in terms of our budget. I was very proud 1 year from now, 1 year ahead, that to give back after 10 years of experience, a governance model of the museum, which was really a public-private model, where we had more or less 50-50% of resources. The budget grew by 4 in 10 years, so it was exponential. Now, obviously, that has changed because we don't have. It's harder. It's harder. Competition out there, and I understand, which is, not only understandable, but in a way, I agree with the fact that great philanthropists and great industries and great private corporations now are sort of deflecting their decisions towards more immediate needs in the health structure, etc. But this will give us a lot of space for research and for trying to elaborate new models. I think this is something that the pandemic crisis will leave on the ground. We need to have public support more than we would have liked to 1 year ago. We need to produce contents that are for free, but also others that are on the market. We need to, have that kind of culture, entrepreneurial culture. So while I'm saying we want to defend the research, the educational, and the sort of role that we have in collecting contemporary art today, at the same time we have to look at these institutions while we are thinking our institutional identity and building our institutional identity. We need to think of ourselves also as entrepreneurs, and we need to put that into a system, which is quite a complicated puzzle to put together, but a fascinating one.
So let's avoid this being too much all of us in agreement. I will press you a bit on that.
Sure.
I mean, you say we need more public support, but why should people pay higher taxes to finance your museum, particularly if the people who go tend to be from the more educated groups? How can we finance museums in the future?
Well, not higher taxes, but taxes. People need to pay taxes if we want our welfare to be efficient and to work. And we need to use that money efficiently. So for me, in education, in culture, in health, in the wealth, culture is a part of our welfare system. Okay, so what we are looking for is a mixed system. And your question could be reversed. What would we want a country or a civilization that does not invest in culture, that does not put money in culture? What kind of idea of our community, of our common community, would that be? Personally, I wrote some articles in the last months arguing that there is one way, that there is one sort of leverage that we should use, a new one, because what happens today, and we need that, I'm not saying that we don't need that anymore, but what happens today is that public money flows into the supply side of the culture system. We need it now, as I said before. The pandemic has, hit hard. But what I would like to see more is public money devoted more on the demand side. I argue that the access to culture, not only to Uffizi and MAXXI, this is a general, and in fact, I want competition around that. I don't want money for MAXXI. I think that the kind of economic crisis that we're going through will leave on the ground more, obviously, social and economic poverty, but also a lot of educational and cultural poverty. And we need to support the idea that citizens can, how do you say this in Italian, in English, can detract from their taxes a portion of their culture expenditure, as we do with, drugs, with pharmaceuticals. I know this is it's a way of conceiving our welfare system as a whole, and if we consider culture as a cure for for spiritual well-being, not for physical well-being, for social integration, as a mean for social integration, and for and there are tons of research that even the World Health Organization has done on the general effects that access to culture, to museums, to theater, movies, can do in terms of also preventing mental sickness. There's a lot of that, a lot of that research. So I think we should avoid sort of giving bonuses here and there. We definitely need for the next year or so still to be helped. So I'm not advocating to reduce that, but I think that on a long run, what we should do is we should recognize that families spending for themselves and for their kids to access culture and access on a personal way, not digitally. So I'm talking about a physical access to culture, to theaters, to movies, to museums, should be recognized as a mean for increasing our general well-being, our general, social capital, social and cultural capital.
Thank you. Perhaps I can ask Eike, but in a sense you come at this from a different position. As you were saying, the princes set up the Uffizi. How would you like the Uffizi to be financed? And what do you think is a legitimate way of financing a museum that has so much wealth in terms of not just what's in terms of publicly available material, but also in its deposits? What's
well,
a
and
good way?
also, I mean, we do. It came as a shock to us. I mean, last year, normally we self-financed not 100%, but actually 120%. So actually, 20% of our proceeds went to other museums, and this year more than 50% of our budget actually was covered by the government. So I personally think that I very much hope that this is an exception. I hope that we will get beyond that very soon, and that we will be able to self-finance again very soon. I think we had two different strategy. I think there's two things to think about. One thing that we've implemented actually is a sort of a Robin Hood principle. So basically, the Uffizi is a group of museums. Most people come from all over the world to see the Uffizi. Far less people come to see the Pitti Palace and the Boboli Gardens, but we've been using those proceeds to restore those galleries, to update them, to make them safer, to acquire works of art for them, to finance shows for them, and also people typically come in the summer. So what we started right after arrived, we didn't do the big shows in the summer anymore, but in the winter when there's mostly locals, regionals, and nationals. And so people come to see special exhibitions when they actually don't have to stand in line with people who come to see for the first and oftentimes only time in their life the Venus by Botticelli. I think this Robin Hood principle could go far beyond the Uffizi or the Colosseum, the Pompeii and others. We could really, apart from being attractors in a perspective of tourism especially, and tourism really in a very neutral way, because there's lots of positive effects as well as negative ones. We could go and finance the museums around. We've started to do that, and we've done that even last year with smaller museums, the Archaeological Museum in Florence, the Museum of the Opificio delle Pietre Dure, that actually last August had their highest number ever in visitors, because since October 2019, with the Uffizi ticket, you get in for free into the Opificio delle Pietre Dure. And this also then comes down to the effect that we have on the local and regional economy, which is at least tenfold what we get ourselves. So, and we've, again, whoever might have had the slightest doubt about that very, very strong economic effect, we saw it last June before we reopened the museum. Some restaurants had no clients at all. The day we reopened, all the restaurants in the center of Florence had lots of clients, and then many of them reopened. The hotels reopened as well. So I think big museums will have a future, big attractors will have a future, but I think they will have to rethink their role. I think the other aspect to think about, and that's perhaps the most important policy change, I think, in a strategic way that I would suggest, is to really tie the museums closer to regional and to local government, because it is essential if you live in the outskirts of a big city, or if you live in a smaller town, that you have your library there, that you have your museum there, where you bring guests, where children get their first impression, and these should be always free for people who live there. Now the big attractors should work together with them, maybe produce shows that travel to them, or do shows together, so that people actually also get a little bit around the region, and also people who come as tourists. And this brings us to an even more important point, because this leads to a far more ecological form of travels and tourism, to a slower way of traveling and of seeing works of art, studying works of art, and you can combine it. Now, at the moment we're setting up a network of museums to the Uffizi Diffusi, and the idea is really to be able to stay in the countryside and then take your bicycle to go to a town, see the museum, have lunch there, take your bicycle, see maybe another museum, or go and listen to a concert, and then go back to the place where you're staying overnight. And then you go to the big attractors. Of course, you always go there, but then you will already be prepared in a totally different way. And I think and that is the big difference. So you won't always jet between London, Paris, Berlin, Rome, New York, and Shanghai. But instead of taking 20 trips of that kind every year, you take one trip to Umbria, you take one trip to the north of France, you take one trip to Scotland, perhaps one trip to Tuscany, and you see so much more, you learn so much more. And also this old idea to combine the museum with the library, I think this is also very, very important, both from the research point of view as well as from the education point of view, but also from the outreach point of view. There were convincing logistical reasons when the British Museum, the British Library were separated, but in the beginning, in 1853, they were totally the same thing, and the British Museum for a long time was mainly a library and known as a library. The Uffizi fortunately still has its early 18th century library built by Giovanni Battista Foggini. And in fact, I mean, the library is really the heart, even architecturally, of the museum. But of the 4.5 million visitors that the museum got before the pandemic crisis, of course, not even 0.0001% got to the library. But that's a different sort of tourism, of course. If you have a local library in a town in Tuscany and the museum combined with it, and there are examples for that. For instance, in Montelupo, there is such an example. It really becomes a habit for everyone to go to the museum, to go to the library, learn immediately if you think something is interesting, if you think something puzzles you. And of course, a modern library isn't just books, it's also computers, it's activities to get into discussion and so on. So I think this is really the future, but you have to tie it to the local government because then on a local level you can easily justify why you spend money for that. It's far more difficult if this is centralized and it's far more abstract from the actual usage.
So if you want to have this local and regional integration, if you had to make one policy proposal about how to achieve that, because we know that in Italy there's a lot of fragmentation, what would it be? I mean, how would you, in practical terms, actually link up with these different layers of government that are often in conflict with each other?
Well, exactly. I mean, one could start on, actually, you could start on each of these levels if you wanted to. The most easiest, I mean, the easiest way would probably to start with the Code of Cultural Heritage from 2004, where actually, I mean, the ground for that is already laid. The fruition is already given to the regions, and of course the regions then could enact laws that would empower the interaction with the cities, and especially with small towns, and on a regional level, of course, you could also finance that. So I think this, from a legislative point of view, would probably be the easiest way to do it. But fortunately, if you have these different layers, as I think in all European countries, really we do have, even the smaller ones, interestingly. Well, maybe not San Marino or Monaco, but if you go beyond that, I mean, then you really have the possibility to work also from the lower. It's almost could be almost a grassroots movement from the towns, but it could also start with regions. It could start, however, also on a central level. It could even start on the supranational level from the European Union. So I think there's nothing to say against that, and perhaps even at the global level from UNESCO.
So Next Generation EU might finance museums. Giovanna, you started off by saying something quite different. You said MAXXI is a national museum. So Eike has talked about how the Uffizi is becoming a multi-level museum.
I think I don't want to be misunderstood on that. I just was saying that MAXXI has a national collection. But I very much agree. And talking about Europe, three ideas and three thoughts. First, Ursula von der Leyen launched this concept of a new European Bauhaus. And I think this concept really is a very interesting stimulus and framework idea for institutions and cultural institutions to work within. Because what was the Bauhaus really? The Bauhaus was a research center where aesthetics, politics, and social impact were together. And so, I mean, this is how I would describe MAXXI today. I mean, where aesthetics, ethical implications, and policy and social implications are, together. So I think there's a great occasion, and we're working around this notion to sort of connect. Well, I obviously look at the sort of contemporary scene, but I think this is very valuable also for for museums like Uffizi as research centers. So one thing I would say is we really need to build on this idea, on this notion of a new European Bauhaus and connect, and we're doing a lot of work around that, European institutions that really have blurred the limits and the confini, the boundaries, thank you, amongst, disciplines. How much science, how much digital innovation, how much AI is in the creative process of artists and architects today? A lot. How much social implication is in the way artists conceive their role in society today? Huge issue. So that's one thought. And then on the opposite side, the grassroots. On the opposite side, the bottom-up process. We experienced some very interesting projects. One of the projects we have been working around in the last years, not recently, but in the last years, is called The Independent. And The Independent was really a way of looking at platforms for independent art, for independent contemporary art all over Italy, not only in Rome, and to sort of highlight it and to give it a platform. Third thought, archives and libraries. There's one area of MAXXI, apart from the offices, that never closed. That was the library. We never closed it. In safeguarding safety and social and physical distancing, we never closed it, and also the archives, because we really think that in a Renaissance idea of our identity, that is the heart of the institution. In fact, there's a fourth idea I just wanted to put on the table. If Uffizi is a Robin Hood model, we just launched our legendary ticket. What is our legendary ticket? This is a sort of, an idea, well, first of all, of trust in the future. A legendary ticket is a ticket that we are selling today that we're closed, so it's not usable immediately, and that can be used for 100 years. So it's really a crowdfunding trick, which we need badly, but it's also the idea that contemporary art, contemporary architecture, contemporary design has a legendary time mark within itself. It's not, it's not going to end. The pandemic is not a parenthesis of our life. We will probably need to inhabit this world for a long time, but it's legendary the way we are wishing and which we think that art can give its contribution to the way we need to reshape the new world. And it's not just, an aesthetic option. I mean, for me, aesthetic, it's, well, I was instructed by De Sanctis and by Croce and by, we have an incredible history of, philosophy and of aesthetics that has removed the idea of, an aesthetics sort of, I'm not sure I know how to say this in English, but a sort of a superficial and not unnecessary structure of our cognitive and social behavior. And I don't think this is the case. So, legendary ticket to raise money, to make sure that maybe I buy a ticket today and I I offer it to my grandchild in 100 years, and to sort of understand that the creative process is embedded in the way we think of our future.
That's a very exciting vision of museums, multi-level, local, regional, national, European, with different sources of funding, different groups, multidisciplinary. I like it, and linked to universities, so I like this because it matches what we do here. We have a course, several courses which are indeed multidisciplinary in this field. You even brought up politics, which I'm glad to hear. I'm going to ask a question. Are people able to put questions to the speakers with Lewis TV? Can people send in questions? No, so we're not yet with interactive TV, but we're going to be there very soon, I'm sure. So I think probably we should close. Thank you very much, Giovanna and Eike, for a very interesting debate and lots and lots of new ideas for the museums, not just of the past, but also of the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.